Where the ocean meets the sunrise. Florida is often introduced by its sunshine. Warm beaches stretch for miles along two coastlines. Palm trees sway in the coastal breeze. Pelicans glide just above the water, while waves roll gently onto white sand. Across the state, wetlands shimmer beneath the morning light, and cypress trees stand quietly in the still waters of the Everglades. For millions of people, Florida is a place of vacations, family memories, and new beginnings. Visitors come to watch rocket launches along the Space Coast, explore coral reefs in the Florida Keys, stroll through historic streets in St. Augustine, or simply enjoy another beautiful sunset over the Gulf. Yet, like every place where people build communities, Florida also carries chapters of history that are far more difficult to remember. Tonight, our journey is not about fear. It is not about sensational headlines. It is about justice. Behind every homicide investigation are lives that mattered, families forever changed, and investigators determined to uncover the truth. Every solved case represents years of dedication, careful evidence collection, and countless hours spent pursuing answers. Welcome to Cozy Night Stories. Tonight, we'll travel across Florida, exploring several homicide investigations that helped shape the state's criminal justice history. As always, our purpose is remembrance, compassion, and respect. The people we remember tonight were far more than names in newspaper archives. They were sons and daughters, parents and grandparents, friends, neighbors, classmates, and co-workers. Their stories deserve to be remembered with dignity, and the investigators who sought justice deserve to be remembered for their perseverance. As evening settles across the Sunshine State, our journey begins. Before we begin tonight's journey, if you enjoy true crime stories, I'd be honored to have you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes in the series. Your support helps this channel continue exploring the stories behind the places we call home. Now, let's begin. Case 1. Panic in a College Town. Danny Rolling and the Gainesville Ripper, 1990. 1.1. A late August in north-central Florida. To really understand what happened in Gainesville during the late summer of 1990, you have to picture what a college town feels like in late August. Gainesville is located in north-central Florida, surrounded by rolling hills, large oak trees draped with Spanish moss, and quiet freshwater springs. It's a town dominated by the University of Florida and Santa Fe College. For most of the summer, the city is relatively quiet. The local shops are uncrowded, traffic is light, and the hot, humid summer air hangs thick over the empty residential streets. But every year, right around the third week of August, the town completely changes. Thousands of college students stream back into the city all at once. U-Haul trucks line the residential streets. Parents help unpack boxes in apartment parking lots. And young adults meet up with old friends to talk about their upcoming fall classes. It's a time filled with excitement, new beginnings, independence, and energy. In late August 1990, that lively atmosphere was everywhere. Students were settling into off-campus apartment complexes scattered throughout the city, places like Williamsburg Village and Gatorwood. These were typical Florida apartments, surrounded by pine trees, featuring sliding glass doors that opened onto small balconies or patios, and full of young people living on their own for the first time. Nothing about that warm late August week suggested that Gainesville was about to become the center of one of the most intense law enforcement investigations in Florida history. 1.2. The 5 victims. Over a 72-hour period between August 24th and August 27th, 5 young lives were taken. To tell this story respectfully, we have to start with who these 5 people were, because they were far more than just names on a police report. They were sons, daughters, roommates, and promising young adults with entire lives ahead of them. Sonia Larson, just 18 years old, was a freshman at the University of Florida. She had moved to Gainesville from Summerfield, Florida. Sonia was known for her bright smile, her love for music, and her deep bond with her family. She was excited to start her college journey. Christina Powell, 17 years old, was Sonia's roommate at the Williamsburg Village apartment complex. Christina was a pre-med student with an incredible academic drive. Friends remembered her as kind, thoughtful, and deeply dedicated to her studies and her future in healthcare. Krista Hoyt, 18 years old, was an honors student at Santa Fe Community College, who also worked as a night shift dispatch clerk for the Alachua County Sheriff's Office. Krista was extremely organized, responsible, and respected by the deputies who worked alongside her. She dreamed of a career in law enforcement or criminal justice. Tracy Pauls, 23 years old, was a pre-law student at UF. She had been a high school homecoming queen in her hometown of Merritt Island and was known for her leadership, warmth, and strong sense of loyalty to her friends. Manny Taboada, 23 years old, was Tracy's apartment roommate at Gatorwood Apartments. Manny was a former high school football player from Miami who was studying to become an architect. He was soft-spoken, fiercely protective of his friends, and shared a deep childhood friendship with Tracy. When these 5 young people were attacked in their apartments, the local community was paralyzed with shock. Homicide detectives who arrived at the scenes realized right away that they were dealing with a highly deliberate intruder. The perpetrator moved in the quietest hours of the night, entering through sliding glass doors or unlocked windows. 1.3a City under siege. Word spread across Gainesville rapidly. By Monday morning, August 27th, the entire city was in a state of absolute fear. Parents from all over Florida and the country drove into Gainesville to pick up their children and pack up their belongings. Thousands of students officially withdrew from the university for the semester, leaving classrooms nearly empty. The university offered counseling services and relaxed attendance policies. But for many, staying in Gainesville simply felt impossible. For those who chose to stay or couldn't leave, daily life changed completely overnight. Safety in numbers. Students refused to stay in their own apartments alone. Groups of 10, 15, or 20 students would gather in a single living room every evening, locking all the doors, wedging chairs under the doorknobs, and taking turns staying awake on guard duty throughout the night. Hardware shortages. Local hardware stores sold out of deadbolts, window latches, sliding door security bars, and pepper spray within hours. Anything that could secure a door or window was bought up immediately. Escort patrols, campus security, local police and state troopers organized 24-hour safety escorts for anyone walking across campus or near off-campus housing after dark. A massive task force was immediately established, combining forces from the Gainesville Police Department, the Alachua County Sheriff's Office, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDLE, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. Hundreds of officers worked around the clock following up on thousands of tips from the public. 1.4 The early suspect and the shift in focus. Under enormous pressure to solve the case, investigators initially focused on a local student who lived near one of the crime scenes. He had a history of volatile behavior and arguments with neighbors, which drew early attention. He was brought in for questioning, extensively interviewed and publicly identified in the media as a primary person of interest. However, forensic science was beginning to play a far more decisive role in criminal investigations by 1990. Crime scene technicians had carefully gathered physical evidence from each apartment, including hair fibers, tool marks on door frames, and biological samples. When the lab tested the student's physical profile against the physical evidence recovered from the crime scenes, it became clear that he was not a match. Despite public anxiety and intense pressure to keep him as the primary suspect, detectives followed the physical evidence. They cleared the student and widened their search to look for suspects outside the immediate Gainesville area. 1.5 The Ocala connection and the discovery at the campsite. The true break in the case didn't come from a tip inside Gainesville. It came from a routine arrest in neighboring Marion County, about 30 miles to the south. In September 1990, police in Ocala arrested a 36-year-old man named Danny Harold Rolling following an armed robbery at a Winn-Dixie grocery store. Rolling had engaged officers in a high-speed car chase and fled into a wooded area before being taken into custody. At the time of his arrest, Rolling was an unemployed drifter from Shreveport, Louisiana. He had a long criminal record involving burglaries, robberies, and domestic disputes, and he was wanted for a shooting incident in his hometown. While Rolling was held in the Marion County Jail on the robbery charges, investigators learned that he had been living in a small campsite in a wooded patch near the University of Florida campus around the time of the Gainesville murders. Detectives located Rolling's campsite and executed a search warrant. What they found transformed the entire investigation. 1. Audio recordings. Inside a backpack, officers found a tape recorder containing cassette tapes. On the tapes, Rolling had recorded himself playing an acoustic guitar and singing songs, punctuated by spoken passages where he talked about his violent urges and dark mental state. 2. Physical tools. Investigators recovered a screwdriver and a specific model of buck knife. Forensic examiners carefully compared the knife and screwdriver to tool marks left on the wood frames of the broken doors in the victims' apartments, finding an exact match. 3. Stolen items. Belongings tied to the Gainesville crime scenes, including small items of jewelry, were found in his possessions. 1.6 Forensic confirmation and the trial. While the physical evidence from the campsite was strong, prosecutors needed absolute scientific certainty. By late 1991, advanced DNA analysis, which was still a relatively new tool in American courtrooms, was applied to the case. Samples taken from Danny Rolling were compared against biological evidence recovered from the crime scenes. The results were conclusive. Rolling's DNA matched the evidence from the scenes. The statistical probability of a random match was calculated at 1 in several billion. Facing an overwhelming mountain of physical, forensic, and audio evidence, Danny Rolling made a surprising decision on February 15, 1994, the morning his trial was set to begin. He entered a guilty plea to all counts of first-degree murder, burglary, and sexual battery without any plea bargain in place. During the penalty phase of the trial, prosecutors presented a detailed timeline of his movements and actions, demonstrating that his crimes were deliberate and planned. The defense presented testimony regarding Rolling's troubled childhood, documenting a long history of physical and psychological abuse at the hands of his father, arguing that severe mental illness had shaped his life. After reviewing the evidence, the jury unanimously recommended the death penalty. The judge sentenced Rolling to death. On October 25, 2006, 16 years after the tragic events in Gainesville, Danny Rolling was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Stark, Florida. 1.7 Remembering the Legacy. While the crimes committed in August 1990 brought deep sorrow to North Central Florida, the lasting story of Gainesville is how the community remembered the victims and worked to protect others. The University of Florida established permanent memorial sites and endowing scholarships in honor of Sonia Larson, Christina Powell, Krista Hoyt, Tracy Pauls, and Manny Tabawada. A peaceful wall of remembrance near the campus features painted murals and artwork dedicated to their memory, maintained by students year after year. The tragedy also led to direct, lasting improvements in student safety across the country. Enhanced campus housing security. Off-campus apartment complexes nationwide upgraded their safety standards, installing better outdoor lighting, secure deadbolts, steel doors, and monitored entry systems. The Clary Act context. The events in Gainesville contributed to the broader national movement during the early 1990s to pass legislation requiring colleges and universities to disclose campus crime statistics and safety policies transparently to students and parents. Case 2. The Billboards on the Highway. Oba Chandler and the Rogers Family Murders, 1989. 2.1 A Summer Trip from Ohio. In late May 1989, 36-year-old Joan Rogers, known as Jo to her family and friends, decided to take her two daughters on a summer vacation. Joan lived in Wilshire, Ohio, a small, quiet farming town near the Indiana border. Her husband, Hal Rogers, stayed home to take care of the family dairy farm. For Joan and her daughters, 17-year-old Michelle and 14-year-old Christy, this trip to Florida was a major milestone. It was their first time leaving Ohio together, and they were thrilled to see palm trees, explore theme parks, and catch their first glimpse of the ocean. Michelle was a high school senior with a gentle personality who loved horses and spent much of her free time outdoors. Christ was younger, energetic, and took plenty of photographs during their trip to document every step of their journey. They packed up the family's 1984 dark blue Oldsmobile sedan and drove south. After spending a few fun days visiting Orlando and seeing the sights, Joan, Michelle, and Christy decided to drive west across the state to explore the Tampa Bay coast on June 1, 1989. 2.2 Lost in Tampa and the Vanishing. When Joan drove into the Tampa Bay area on the afternoon of June 1st, she wasn't familiar with the sprawling highway system connecting Tampa, St. Petersburg, and Clearwater. The roads crossed long bridges over blue water, and local exits could easily confuse visitors traveling without a detailed map. Seeking directions, Joan stopped her car near a local convenience store and gas station. While there, she struck up a conversation with a friendly local contractor who owned a boat. He gave her handwritten directions on how to reach a nearby motel, the Days Inn on Route 301, and suggested that they check out a scenic sunset boat cruise along the bay that evening. Joan managed to find the Days Inn and checked into room 251. Inside the room, the three women unpacked their bags, laid out their clothes, and took photos on a small instant camera. Sometime around 7:30 p.m. on June 1st, Joan, Michelle, and Christy left their room, leaving their purses, toothbrush sets, clothes, and unmade beds exactly as they were. They walked out to the parking lot and drove toward the water to meet the man who had offered them the boat ride. When they failed to check out 2 days later, hotel staff noticed that their room remained untouched and their dark blue Oldsmobile was still parked outside. Back in Ohio, Hal Rogers grew increasingly worried when he hadn't heard from his wife or daughters. 2.3 The Discovery in Tampa Bay. On the calm morning of Sunday, June 4th, 1989, crew members on a sailboat navigating Tampa Bay spotted floating objects off Sunshine Skyway Beach near St. Petersburg. When Marine Patrol officers arrived, they made a heartbreaking discovery. 3 female bodies were recovered from the water. Each had been bound with rope, weighted down with heavy 30-pound concrete cinder blocks tied around their necks, and stripped below the waist. The medical examiner confirmed that all 3 victims, Joan, Michelle, and Christy, had died from drowning and asphyxiation, meaning they were thrown into the bay while still alive. The news shocked both the local Tampa Bay community and the quiet farming town of Wilshire, Ohio. Detective squads from the St. Petersburg Police Department, the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office, and the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office joined forces to create a dedicated homicide task force. 2.4 The Brochure and the Handwritten Directions. Investigators searched Joan Rogers' Oldsmobile in the motel parking lot, looking for any physical clue. On the front seat, sitting next to road maps, they found a tourist brochure for the Tampa area. When crime scene technicians dusted the brochure for latent prints and examined its handwritten notes under special lighting, they found something critical. 2 distinct handwritings. Joan had written step-by-step directions to their motel. Above and beside her writing were short notes written in a completely different secondary handwriting, giving specific instructions on how to reach a nearby boat dock. A latent palm print. Forensic technicians managed to lift a clean latent palm print from the paper and another print from the hood of the car, where someone had leaned over the car while talking to Joan. Police ran the palm print through state and federal law enforcement databases, but at the time, no match was found. The unknown man who wrote those directions on the brochure had no prior felony records in Florida that included palm prints. 2.5 The trail goes cold in the billboard campaign. Month after month passed without a break. Investigators interviewed hundreds of boat owners, checked registration records for thousands of aluminum vessels across Tampa Bay, and interviewed suspects, but every lead led to a dead end. By the autumn of 1991, more than 2 years after the murders, detectives knew they had to try something unconventional to keep the case from going completely cold. Detective Jim Hunter and lead investigator FBI profiler Special Agent Jim R. Rexroad suggested taking the suspect's handwriting, the short notes written on Jones' brochure, and placing it where thousands of local commuters would see it every single day. The task force funded giant highway billboards across the Tampa Bay area. The billboards displayed an enlarged image of the handwriting sample alongside a simple question. Images of the handwriting were also printed in local Florida newspapers, shown on local news broadcasts, and featured on national television shows like America's Most Wanted. 2.6 The tip, the palm print, and ship-to-shore records. The billboard strategy turned out to be one of the most successful investigative moves in Florida law enforcement history. A woman living in Tampa was driving past one of the enlarged handwriting billboards when she stopped in her tracks. She recognized the script instantly. It matched the handwriting of Oba Chandler, a 45-year-old aluminum siding contractor who had recently done construction work on her house. She recalled that Chandler was a shady, volatile contractor who owned a 21-foot aluminum boat named Gypsy One. She dug up old financial receipts and signed work contracts Chandler had given her and handed them over to detectives. The task force acted swiftly. Handwriting analysis. FBI document examiners compared Chandler's signed receipts with the brochure directions. The result was a positive, definitive match. Palm print verification. Investigators pulled Chandler's palm prints after obtaining an arrest warrant. Forensic print examiners confirmed that Chandler's right palm print matched the latent print lifted off the brochure and the hood of Joan Rogers' car. Marine radio records. GTE Marine operators testified that Chandler had placed several ship-to-shore radio telephone calls to his wife from his boat, Gypsy One, out on Tampa Bay during the late-night hours of June 1, 1989, the exact night Joan and her daughters vanished. Detectives also uncovered that just 2 weeks before the Rogers family was killed, Chandler had taken a young tourist out on his boat under similar pretenses and attacked her. She survived, reported the assault, and later provided key testimony establishing his pattern of behavior. On September 24, 1992, Oba Chandler was arrested at his home in Hillsborough County. 2.7 The trial, testimony, and execution. Oba Chandler's trial began in September 1994 in Clearwater, Florida. Prosecutors presented a meticulous case showing how Chandler had met Joan, Michelle, and Christe, offered them a sunset boat tour of Tampa Bay, driven them out into open water, and used physical force to restrain them. Taking the stand in his own defense, Chandler admitted that he met the three women, gave them directions, and wrote on the brochure. However, he claimed he left them alive at the dock and had nothing to do with their deaths. His evasive, calm, yet contradictory answers failed to convince the jury. On September 29, 1994, after less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict: guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. On November 4, 1994, Chandler was formally sentenced to death. On November 15, 2011, 22 years after the tragedy, Oba Chandler was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. In February 2014, post-mortem DNA testing linked Chandler's profile to the unsolved 1990 cold case murder of 20-year-old Evelise Barrios Begaris in Coral Springs, Florida. proving that his arrest had taken a dangerous, habitual offender off the streets. 2.8 Remembering Joan, Michelle, and Krista. The Rogers family tragedy left a deep impression on the Tampa Bay region. Hal Rogers spent years maintaining the family dairy farm in Ohio, supported by friends and neighbors who rallied around him during his grief. The case also changed how law enforcement uses public appeals. The decision to put handwriting samples on giant highway billboards was praised nationwide as a creative breakthrough that paved the way for modern public-assisted crime-solving techniques. Most importantly, the memory of Joan, Michelle, and Christ lives on through community remembrance and the dedication of the investigators who spent over 3 years ensuring that justice was served. Case 3. The Dark Side of the Badge. Gerard John Schaefer, The Killer Cop. 1970s. 3.1 Quiet Coastal Highways. To step into the story of Gerard John Schaefer, you have to picture what Florida's Treasure Coast felt like in the early 1970s. St. Lucie and Martin counties were quiet, sun-washed coastal regions filled with dense mangrove swamps, tidal creeks, pine flatwoods, and long stretches of oceanfront highway. State Road, A1A, wound gently along the barrier islands like Hutchinson Island, separated from the mainland by the calm, brackish waters of the Indian River Lagoon. During this era, hitchhiking was a common way for young tourists, high schoolers, and local college students to get around. People moved slowly, doors were often left unlocked, and uniformed law enforcement officers represented complete, unquestioned authority and safety. Gerard John Schaefer, Jr. was a man who hid behind that exact sense of public trust. Born in Wisconsin in 1946 and raised in Florida, Schaefer grew up with ambitions of authority. He briefly attended a Catholic seminary, taught social studies briefly at a local high school, and eventually entered the law enforcement academy. In late 1971, he was hired as a patrol deputy with the Martin County Sheriff's Office. He was given a uniform, a badge, a service weapon, and a marked patrol vehicle. But rather than protecting the public, Schaefer used his position to monitor the remote stretches of Highway A1A, looking for vulnerable young hitchhikers traveling alone or in pairs. 3.2 The Escape at Hutchinson Island. The pivotal moment that unraveled Schaefer's crimes occurred on a hot summer afternoon, July 21, 1972. Two teenage girls, 18-year-old Nancy Trotter and 17-year-old Paula Wells, were hitchhiking along the beach road near Jensen Beach on Hutchinson Island. A marked Martin County Sheriff's cruiser pulled up alongside them. Deputy Schaefer leaned out and told the girls that hitchhiking on the island was illegal, instructing them to get into the back of his patrol car so he could drive them to safety. Trusting his badge, Nancy and Paula got into the vehicle. Instead of driving toward town, Schaefer drove deeper into an undeveloped, dense mangrove swamp area on the island. He ordered the girls out of the cruiser, forced them into the thick brush, and bound them securely to a tree with heavy rope. He threatened them, making it clear they were entirely at his mercy. However, a routine dispatch call came over his police radio. Fearing that another deputy might notice his absence from his assigned patrol zone, Schaefer told the girls he had to respond to the call, warning them that he would return shortly. The moment his cruiser drove off, Nancy Trotter and Paula Wells demonstrated extraordinary courage and composure. Working in tandem despite their fear, they twisted and rubbed their bound hands against the bark of the tree, gradually loosening the knots. Within minutes, they freed themselves, sprinted out of the swamp onto the main road, and flagged down a passing motorist who drove them directly to the police station. When the Martin County Sheriff confronted Deputy Schaefer later that evening, Schaefer claimed the incident was a harmless scare tactic meant to teach young people a lesson about the real dangers of hitchhiking. The sheriff rejected his explanation, fired him immediately on July 22, 1972, and placed him under arrest for false imprisonment and aggravated assault. 3.3. The discovery at Hutchinson Island and the locked trunk. While Schaefer was free on bail awaiting trial for the assault charges involving Nancy and Paula, local law enforcement began looking into several open missing persons cases along Florida's East Coast. On April 1, 1973, construction workers clearing brush for a residential development near the same mangrove area on Hutchinson Island made a tragic discovery. Human remains buried in shallow, sandy soil. Dental records quickly identified the remains as 17-year-old Susan Place and 16-year-old Georgia Jessup. Both girls had vanished in September 1972 after being seen getting into a car with Schaefer. With physical proof of homicide on land Schaefer frequented, detectives secured search warrants for Schaefer's apartment and his mother's residence in Plantation, Florida. In a locked green trunk stored in his mother's garage, investigators uncovered a massive, chilling stash of evidence: personal belongings, driver's licenses, student ID cards, jewelry, watches, teeth dental plates, and clothing belonging to over a dozen missing young women from across Florida and neighboring states. Graphic notebooks, handwritten stories, journals, and drawings depicting acts of violence against bound captives in remote swamp settings. 3.4. The trial, incarceration, and end. Gerard Schaefer's trial for the murders of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup opened on October 1, 1973, in St. Lucie County. The prosecution built an airtight case around the personal effects recovered directly from Schaefer's locked trunk, including Susan Place's jewelry and driver's license, and paired them with the powerful, detailed testimony of Nancy Trotter and Paula Wells, who recounted his methods in the same mangrove swamp. On October 1, 1973, the jury found Gerard John Schaefer guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms at Florida State Prison in Rayford. During his 2 decades in prison, Schaefer engaged in long correspondences with true crime authors and FBI behavioral analysts, such as Special Agent Robert Ressler, offering detailed, often contradictory insights into the minds of serial offenders. While he bragged to fellow inmates about committing dozens of murders, he officially maintained his innocence in legal filings. On December 3, 1995, Schaefer's life came to an abrupt end inside his cell at Florida State Prison, where he was killed during a personal dispute with a fellow inmate named Vincent Rivera. 3.5. Honoring the memory and the lessons learned. The story of Gerard Schaefer remains a sobering chapter in Florida law enforcement history, highlighting the dark potential for authority to be abused. Yet, the true heroics of this case rest with Nancy Trotter and Paula Wells. Their incredible presence of mind under life-threatening conditions not only saved their own lives, but also provided the crucial evidence needed to remove a dangerous predator from the streets permanently. Their actions helped bring closure to the families of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, ensuring that the truth was documented, remembered, and answered with justice. Case 4. The Hit on Meridian Road. The Murder of Dan Markell, 2014. 4.1. A Summer Morning in Benton Hills. To understand the tragic story of Dan Markell, you have to picture the peaceful, tree-lined streets of Benton Hills, a quiet residential neighborhood located in North Tallahassee. Tallahassee, the capital of Florida, feels quite different from the coastal resort towns of the South. It is defined by rolling hills, canopy roads shaded by massive live oak trees, moss hanging low over brick sidewalks, and a calm academic rhythm driven by Florida State University and Florida A&M University. On the morning of Friday, July 18, 2014, 41-year-old Dan Markel was following his standard daily routine. Dan was a highly respected, widely published criminal law professor at FSU. Born in Montreal and educated at Harvard, Princeton, and Cambridge, he was known by colleagues and students as a passionate, brilliant scholar who loved debate, cared deeply about his students, and devoted his life to his two young sons. That morning was bright and quiet. Dan dropped his two boys off at their preschool, went to his local health club, Premier Health and Fitness, for a workout around 9 a.m., and then drove his black Honda Accord back home to 2116 Trescott Drive. He pulled into his driveway at approximately 11 a.m., talking on his phone via a hands-free headset with a colleague about an upcoming legal conference. As Dan pulled into his attached garage, a light green Toyota Prius that had been trailing him pulled into the driveway directly behind his car. An unknown individual stepped out, approached the driver's side window, and fired 2 shots. A neighbor who heard the quiet pops immediately dialed 911. Emergency responders arrived within minutes and rushed Dan to the hospital, but despite every effort by medical staff, he passed away early the following morning on July 19, 2014. When homicide detectives from the Tallahassee Police Department processed the crime scene, they noted right away that Dan's wallet, cash, watch, and electronics were untouched inside the car. This was not a robbery or a carjacking gone wrong. It was a deliberate, targeted ambush. 4.2 Family conflict and the legal battle. As investigators began tracing Dan Markel's personal and professional life, one specific area of intense conflict emerged: a bitter, ongoing post-divorce custody dispute. Dan had married Wendy Adelson, a fellow law professor at FSU, in 2006. The couple had 2 sons before Wendy filed for divorce in 2012. Following the divorce, a severe disagreement arose over where the children should live. Relocation dispute. Wendy and her wealthy family, based in South Florida, wanted her to move with the children from Tallahassee to Coral Gables near Miami, so her parents could assist in raising them. Court rulings. A family court judge denied Wendy's legal motion to relocate the children, keeping them in Tallahassee so both parents could remain actively involved in their daily lives. Escalating motions. In the months leading up to his murder, Dan had filed legal motions restricting his ex-mother-in-law, Donna Adelson, from having unsupervised visitation with his sons due to alleged disparaging remarks she made about him, and he was fighting attempts to alter the financial terms of their divorce agreement. While Wendy Adelson cooperated with police during initial interviews and denied any knowledge of a plot, state prosecutors and the FBI turned their attention to her family's dental practice in South Florida, run by her brother, Dr. Charlie Adelson, and their mother, Donna. 4.3 digital footprints, toll records, and Operation Bump. The investigation required almost 2 full years of patient, meticulous detective work. A joint task force consisting of the Tallahassee Police Department, the FBI, and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDLE, began building a web of digital evidence. Tracking the Prius. Investigators painstakingly reviewed thousands of hours of highway surveillance footage, SunPass toll booth logs, and bus camera videos. They identified a rented light green Toyota Prius with a missing hubcap and a side sticker that drove from South Florida to Tallahassee on July 17, 2014, followed Dan Markel's car on the morning of July 18th and immediately sped back south down the Florida Turnpike after the shooting. Cell tower trajectory. FBI cellular analysts cross-referenced cell tower records along that exact highway route. 2 specific phone numbers moved in tandem with the Prius. Phones belonging to Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera, a leader in the Florida branch of the Latin Kings gang, the intermediary. Neither Garcia nor Rivera had any personal connection to Dan Markel. However, records showed that Garcia was the father of children with Catherine Magbanua, a woman who was simultaneously employed at the Adelson family dental practice and dating Charlie Adelson at the time of the murder. In May 2016, police arrested Garcia and Rivera. Rivera eventually agreed to a plea deal, testifying that Magbanua had recruited them on behalf of the Adelson family to execute the hit in exchange for $100,000 in cash, split among the co-conspirators. To gather direct recorded evidence against the masterminds, the FBI executed a bold covert action dubbed Operation Bump. An undercover federal agent approached Donna Adelson on a sidewalk in South Florida, handing her a newspaper article about Dan Markel's murder with a handwritten dollar amount, pretending to be a blackmailer who knew what happened. The bump worked precisely as intended. Wiretaps captured panicked, coded phone calls between Donna and her son Charlie, discussing payments, law enforcement pressure, and how to handle the situation. 4.4 courtroom verdicts and eventual justice. The legal proceedings extended over a decade, bringing each participant to justice step by step. 2016, 2019. Luis Rivera pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and received a 19-year sentence in exchange for his truthful testimony. Sigfredo Garcia was tried in October 2019, found guilty of first-degree murder, and sentenced to life in prison without parole. 2022. Catherine Magbanua's first trial ended in a hung jury, but upon retrial in May 2022, she was convicted of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and solicitation, receiving a life sentence plus 2 30-year terms. November 2023. Charlie Adelson was arrested at his Fort Lauderdale home in April 2022. During his November 2023 trial, he testified that he was the victim of an extortion attempt by the hitmen after the fact. The jury rejected his story entirely, finding him guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and solicitation. He was sentenced to life without parole. September 2024. Just 1 week after her son Charlie was convicted, in late 2023, 73-year-old Donna Adelson was arrested at Miami International Airport while holding one-way plane tickets to Vietnam, a country with no extradition treaty with the United States. She was brought to trial in Tallahassee, where a jury convicted her of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and solicitation. 4.5 Remembering Dan Markel and the Markel Act. The murder of Dan Markel stands as a tragic example of a family dispute escalating into an unthinkable crime, but it also highlights how relentless digital forensics, federal wiretaps, and law enforcement collaboration can untangle even the most carefully disguised hit-for-hire plots. Dan's memory continues to be honored by his former students, fellow law professors, and colleagues around the world through academic lectures, legal essays, and memorial funds. Furthermore, his death inspired real statutory change in Florida. In 2022, the Florida legislature passed the Markel Act, a law designed to grant grandparents standing to petition courts for visitation rights with their grandchildren when a living parent is implicated or charged in the murder of the other parent. The law serves as a lasting legal protection, helping to ensure that children remain connected to both sides of their family tree, even in the wake of unimaginable tragedy. Case 5. The Tragedy at Lakewood Ranch. The Ashley Benefield Black Swan Case 2020. 5.1. A master planned community and a whirlwind romance. To understand the story of Ashley and Doug Benefield, you have to picture Lakewood Ranch, a quiet, master-planned suburban community situated just east of Bradenton and Sarasota in Manatee County. It is a neighborhood defined by manicured lawns, peaceful lakes, winding walking trails, and modern stucco homes, a setting built around order, family living, and quiet routines. In the summer of 2016, 24-year-old Ashley Byers, a former professional ballerina and model, met 58-year-old Doug Benefield at a political fundraising dinner in Palm Beach. Doug was a Navy veteran, technology defense contractor, and widowed father from South Carolina, whose wife of 30 years had passed away 9 months earlier. The connection between them moved with extraordinary speed. Just 13 days after their initial meeting, Ashley and Doug were married. Together, they set out to build an ambitious artistic project called the American Ballet Healing, a novel dance company designed to support dancers who had suffered physical injuries, struggled with eating disorders, or faced professional burnout. They moved to Charleston, South Carolina, renting space, securing funding, and recruiting dozens of professional dancers, choreographers, and musicians from across the nation. 5.2. Dissolution and escalating legal disputes. Within months of its founding, the ballet company unraveled due to internal financial strain, administrative disputes, and management disagreements. Dancers were left unpaid, and the company dissolved before its inaugural performance. As the business venture collapsed, the marriage fell apart just as quickly. Separation. Ashley, who was pregnant with the couple's daughter, left Charleston and returned to Florida to live with her mother in Lakewood Ranch. Doug remained in South Carolina, desperate to repair the relationship and be involved in his newborn daughter's life. A web of complaints. Over the next 2 years, Ashley filed dozens of formal complaints, domestic violence injunction petitions, and emergency custody motions against Doug in both South Carolina and Florida courts. She made allegations ranging from poisoning to physical aggression. Investigative findings. Local law enforcement agencies, state social workers, and child protective services in 2 states thoroughly investigated every single report filed by Ashley. None of the allegations resulted in criminal charges, protective orders, or substantiated findings against Doug Benefield. Judges repeatedly granted Doug supervised and eventually unsupervised visitation rights with his infant daughter. Despite the persistent litigation, Doug continued to hold out hope for a reconciliation, frequently texting friends that he wanted his family to be whole again. 5.3. The night of September 27, 2020. By late September 2020, Ashley and Doug had reached a temporary truce. They agreed to pack up furniture from Ashley's mother's home on Central Park Way in Lakewood Ranch and drive to Maryland together, where they planned to live in separate residences while co-parenting their daughter away from local family tension. On Sunday evening, September 27, 2020, Doug drove his rental moving truck to the Lakewood Ranch house to pack heavy boxes and furniture. Ashley's mother left the house to take the toddler for a walk nearby, leaving Ashley and Doug alone inside the residence. At approximately 7 p.m., 4 gunshots rang out from inside the home. 2 bullets struck Doug Benefield, one in his leg and one through his torso. Ashley ran out of the house to a neighbor's doorstep carrying her .45 caliber handgun, claiming she had been forced to shoot Doug in self-defense after he allegedly attacked her and backed her into a corner during an argument. Emergency medical technicians arrived quickly and rushed Doug to a nearby hospital, but he succumbed to his internal injuries later that evening. When homicide detectives from the Manatee County Sheriff's Office interviewed Ashley and examined her immediately after the incident, they noted key physical details. No marks or physical trauma. Ashley bore no visible scratches, red marks, or bruises indicating a physical struggle or assault. Forensic trajectory. Ballistics analysis showed that Doug was shot from an angle that suggested he was turning away or not advancing aggressively when the fatal bullet was fired. 5.4. The Stand Your Ground hearing and trial. Ashley Benefield was formally arrested and charged with second-degree murder. Prior to going to trial, her defense team filed a motion under Florida's statutory Stand Your Ground law, seeking full immunity from criminal prosecution by arguing that she had a reasonable fear of imminent death or severe bodily harm when she fired her weapon. In July 2023, Manatee County Circuit Judge Stephen Mercer presided over a multi-day pretrial evidentiary hearing. After evaluating testimony from medical examiners, ballistics experts, and investigating deputies, the judge officially denied the immunity motion. The court ruled that Ashley was not in imminent danger of death or great bodily harm at the moment of the shooting, paving the way for a trial. The trial took place in Bradenton in July 2024 and attracted significant national media attention, frequently dubbed the Black Swan trial due to Ashley's background in professional ballet. The prosecution argued that Ashley was a calculating actor who used false accusations to keep Doug away from their daughter, resorting to lethal force when court rulings continued to grant him parental rights. The defense maintained that she lived in constant, genuine fear and shot him in a desperate act of self-preservation. On July 30th, 2024, after deliberating for several hours, the jury acquitted Ashley of second-degree murder, but found her guilty of the lesser-included charge of manslaughter with a firearm. In October 2024, she was sentenced to 20 years in state prison. The case brought a quiet, tragic close to a complex story, serving as a reminder of how quickly personal disputes can escalate, while reinforcing the rigorous evidentiary standards required by Florida courts to justify the use of lethal force. Conclusion. Reflections on justice, memory, and rest. We have covered a vast terrain tonight, spanning 50 years of Florida history across 5 distinct cases. The quiet college apartments of Gainesville in 1990, where forensic science and public cooperation stopped a serial intruder. The open waters of Tampa Bay in 1989, where a creative billboard campaign brought justice to Joan, Michelle, and Christy Rogers. The remote mangrove swamps of Hutchinson Island in 1972, where the immense courage of 2 young women brought an end to an abuse of official authority. The quiet neighborhood of Benton Hills in 2014, where meticulous digital forensics and law enforcement collaboration unraveled a complex conspiracy to honor Dan Markel. The suburban streets of Lakewood Ranch in 2020, where physical evidence and courtroom scrutiny evaluated the solemn boundaries of self-defense laws. Behind every single one of these legal proceedings, news headlines and forensic breakthroughs are real human lives, families who grieved, detectives who worked tirelessly through late nights, and communities that rallied together to seek the truth. True crime, when told with calm respect, isn't about the darkness of the acts themselves. It is about the light that follows, the dedication of investigators, the resilience of survivors, the pursuit of fairness in our justice system, and the quiet dignity of remembering those who were lost. If you're still with me tonight, thank you. A quick like lets YouTube know to share it with other true crime fans, and I'd love to hear in the comments where you're listening from, or which state you'd like us to visit in a future episode. Reading your comments is one of my favorite parts of creating these stories. Case 6. The Quiet Quiet of Pensacola. The fact-based story of Judias Buenoano, the Black Widow of Pensacola. 6.1. Pensacola, 1971. If you drive through North Florida in the middle of summer, the first thing you notice is how heavy the air feels. It stays warm long after the sun goes down. In Escambia County, around Pensacola, the pines line the two-lane roads, and at night, the only sound for miles is the hum of cicadas in the high branches. In the early 1970s, Judias Buenoano was living a life that seemed, from the outside, entirely quiet. Most people knew her as Judy. She worked hard, held down jobs in healthcare as a nurse's aide, and raised her children. To her neighbors, she was a quiet woman who kept her lawn tidy and stayed mostly to herself. Judy was born Judias Welty in Texas back in 1943. Her childhood wasn't easy. Her mother passed away when Judy was very young, and she spent time moving between family members, foster care, and state institutions. By the time she was a young adult, she had moved east into the Florida Panhandle, looking for a fresh start. In 1962, she met a man named James Goodyear. James was a sergeant in the United States Air Force, stationed near Orlando at the time, and later at Eglin Air Force Base near Pensacola. They got married, settled down, and started a family. They had 2 children together, a son named Michael and a daughter named Kimberly. James also adopted Judy's older son, James Jr., whom she had given birth to a few years earlier. To anyone looking at the Goodyear house in the late 1960s, it was standard military family life. James was a steady provider, quiet and reliable. Judy was organized, efficient, and managed the household expenses carefully. Then in 1970, James Goodyear returned home after serving a tour of duty in Vietnam. He was 37 years old, in good physical condition, and glad to be back home with his family in North Florida. 6.2. A sudden illness. It was in the summer of 1971 when James began to feel unwell. It didn't happen all at once. It started with vague, uncomfortable symptoms. He felt tired. His stomach hurt after meals. He began experiencing nausea that didn't seem to clear up, no matter what medicine he took. In the 1970s, medical diagnostic technology was very different from what it is today. When a young, healthy veteran came down with stomach cramps and persistent vomiting, doctors looked for common culprits: a virus brought back from overseas, food poisoning, or severe ulcers. Over a period of a few weeks, James's health deteriorated steadily. He was admitted to the Naval Hospital in Pensacola. Doctors ran standard blood panels and routine scans, but everything came back inconclusive. They treated his symptoms as best they could with fluids and bed rest. Judy was at his bedside constantly. Hospital staff noted how attentive she was. She brought him drinks, sat with him through the evening hours, and checked in on his care. Despite the medical care, James Goodyear's organ systems began to fail one by one. On September 16, 1971, less than a month after his symptoms became severe, James passed away. The initial cause of death listed on his death certificate was heart failure secondary to an unknown medical condition or natural illness. At the time, no one questioned it. James was a veteran. His wife was grief-stricken, and the funeral was held with military honors. Shortly after his death, Judy collected on several life insurance policies she had taken out on James, totaling roughly $28,000, a significant sum in 1971. With that money, she bought a home, maintained her family, and tried to move forward. 6.3. Moving on. A few years passed. Judy moved her family around a bit, eventually setting up a life in Colorado for a period, where she met a man named Bobby Joe Morris. Morris was a gentle, easygoing man. He and Judy began living together, and for a while things seemed stable again. But by 1977, a familiar pattern began to repeat itself. Bobby Joe Morris began complaining of feeling weak. He had severe nausea, stomach pains, and numbness in his hands and feet. He was hospitalized multiple times, but doctors couldn't pin down what was wrong. In January 1978, Bobby Joe Morris collapsed and died. Once again, the medical examiners concluded that he had succumbed to a sudden severe illness, likely a heart issue or internal infection. Once again, Judy collected on life insurance policies. After Bobby Joe's death, Judy decided to return home to North Florida. She changed her last name to Buenoano, which is a Spanish translation of good year, bueno for good, año for year, and settled back into the Pensacola area. By 1979, her eldest son, Michael, was 19 years old. Michael was a bright young man who decided to follow in his father's footsteps by joining the U.S. Army. He completed his basic training and was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. In the autumn of 1979, Michael came home to Pensacola to visit his mother before deploying overseas. While at home, Michael suddenly became violently ill. 6.4. The river and the canoe. Michael's symptoms were strangely identical to those his father had experienced 8 years earlier. He suffered from extreme nausea, persistent vomiting, and severe abdominal cramping. But more alarming was what happened to his nervous system. Michael began losing sensation in his legs and arms. The weakness became so pronounced that he lost the ability to walk without support. Doctors at the military hospital were baffled. Tests showed severe nerve damage, a condition called peripheral neuropathy. The muscles in his legs atrophied to the point that he had to be fitted with heavy metal leg braces and arm crutches just to move around. He was honorably discharged from the Army due to his disability and returned to Pensacola to live with Judy, who took on the role of his full-time caregiver. On May 13, 1980, Judy took Michael and his younger brother out for a quiet day on the East River in Santa Rosa County. It was a warm, overcast day. They rented a small metal canoe. Michael, wearing his heavy leg braces and carrying his crutches, sat in the middle of the boat. According to Judy's initial statement to the police, the canoe hit a submerged log or snag in the river and flipped over. Judy and her younger son swam to the bank safely. Michael, weighed down by the heavy steel braces on his legs and unable to use his arms effectively, went beneath the water. He didn't surface. Search teams arrived at the river later that afternoon. Divers recovered Michael's body from the bottom of the East River. He was just 20 years old. At first, local authorities treated it as a tragic accidental drowning, an outdoors accident involving a disabled young man. Judy collected a substantial military life insurance payout following her son's death. To anyone looking at her life from the outside, Judy Buenoano was a deeply unfortunate woman who had suffered unimaginable loss. A husband gone too soon, a partner who died of illness, and a disabled son who drowned in a river. 6.5. Pensacola, 1983. 3 years after Michael's death, Judy was living in Pensacola and running a successful beauty salon. She was engaged to a local businessman named John Gentry, John was a well-liked man in the community. He was doing well financially, and he and Judy seemed very happy together. At Judy's suggestion, they took out substantial life insurance policies on each other, naming one another as beneficiaries. In late 1982, John began experiencing strange health problems. He had bouts of severe dizziness, nausea, and stomach pain that seemed to strike out of nowhere. Judy gave him vitamin C capsules that she claimed would help boost his immune system. Every time he took the capsules, however, his symptoms seemed to worsen. Suspicious, John secretly saved a few of the capsules in his desk drawer instead of swallowing them. Then came the afternoon of June 25, 1983. John Gentry walked out to his car parked near a downtown Pensacola restaurant. He got inside, turned the key in the ignition, and a violent explosion tore through the vehicle. The car bomb blew out the frame of the automobile and left John critically injured. Miraculously, despite severe burns and shrapnel wounds, John survived the blast. Emergency crews rushed him to the hospital, where surgeons worked through the night to save his life. 6.6. The investigation begins. The car bombing changed everything. A car bomb isn't a sudden illness or a boating accident. It is an undeniable act of targeted violence. Detectives with the Pensacola Police Department immediately opened an attempted murder investigation. They began looking into John Gentry's personal and business relationships to find out who could possibly want him dead. When detectives questioned John in his hospital bed, he mentioned the strange illnesses he had been having over the past few months. He also told them about the vitamin C capsules Judy had given him. Investigators executed a search warrant and retrieved the saved capsules from John's home. They sent them to the state crime laboratory for chemical analysis. The results came back quickly. The capsules didn't contain vitamin C. They were packed with paraformaldehyde, a potent, toxic chemical compound used in industrial preservatives and disinfectants. While detectives were processing that information, another team of investigators was looking into Judy's financial records. They found that she had recently tried to collect on John Gentry's $500,000 life insurance policy, claiming to insurance agents that John had died in the bombing before authorities had even confirmed his status. The police began looking backward into Judy Buenoano's past. 6.7. Unraveling the history. When investigators cross-referenced police reports and medical files from other counties and states, the timeline of Judy's life took on a completely different meaning. They looked at the 1980 drowning of her son Michael. They questioned how a mother and an able-bodied brother could safely reach the shore of a calm river, while a young man in leg braces was left to drown in a simple canoe tip-over. The state ordered the exhumation of Michael's body, as well as the body of her first husband, James Goodyear, and her former partner in Colorado, Bobby Joe Morris. Medical examiners from Florida and Colorado performed detailed forensic toxicological tests on the exhumed remains. The tissue tests were conclusive. James Goodyear's body contained lethal levels of arsenic. Bobby Joe Morris's body contained lethal levels of arsenic. Michael's hair and tissue samples showed severe chronic arsenic poisoning, spanning months prior to his drowning, explaining the sudden loss of mobility in his legs that had forced him into braces. For years, Judy had been slowly mixing commercial arsenic, often found in common ant poisons at the time, into the food and drinks of the people closest to her. 6.8. The trial and conclusion. In 1984, Judy Buenoano was put on trial in Orange County for the murder of her son Michael, and in Escambia County for the attempted murder of John Gentry. She was later tried for the 1971 murder of James Goodyear. The courtroom proceedings were quiet, methodical, and packed with technical scientific testimony. Toxicologists explained to the jury how arsenic accumulates in human hair and bone tissue over time, creating a physical timeline of poisoning that matches the exact dates the victims fell ill. Judy maintained her innocence throughout the trials, speaking softly and calmly when questioned. But the physical evidence, the paper trails of insurance policies, and the forensic science were overwhelming. She was convicted on multiple counts, including first-degree murder, attempted murder, and grand theft. On March 30, 1998, Judius Buenoano's legal appeals concluded. Her story remains one of the most thoroughly documented procedural investigations in Florida's legal history, a case where forensic science eventually brought clarity to years of quiet, unexplained tragedies. Case 7. The Shadows of the Sawgrass, the fact-based story of the Ashley Gang, 1915-1924. 7.1. The Old Florida Frontier. Before Florida became a landscape of paved highways and residential neighborhoods, the eastern edge of the Everglades was a vast, unforgiving expanse of sawgrass, cypress swamps, and hidden waterways. In the early 1900s, Palm Beach County and St. Lucie County were sparse settlement outposts. The roads were made of packed sand or crushed coquina shell, and if you strayed just a few miles west of the coastal railroad lines, you were in territory where law enforcement had very little reach. It was in this environment that John Ashley was raised. Born in 1888, he grew up hunting, fishing, and navigating the intricate canal networks and sloughs of the inland Everglades. He knew every hidden cypress head and dry hammock from Fort Myers over to Palm Beach. In late December 1911, an incident occurred deep in the marshlands near Lake Okeechobee. Ashley was involved in a dispute with a local Seminole trapper named DeSoto Tiger over a valuable haul of otter pelts. A physical confrontation ended in DeSoto Tiger's death. Ashley fled into the dense interior of the swamp to avoid questioning. This single event marked the beginning of a multi-year period of instability along Florida's east coast. John Ashley gathered a group of relatives and local acquaintances, a loosely organized group that newspapers would eventually call the Ashley Gang. 7.2. The 1915 Stewart Bank Robbery. By early 1915, the group moved from hiding in the marshlands to active armed robbery. On February 23, 1915, Ashley and two associates entered the quiet town of Stewart, Florida, located along the St. Lucie River. At the time, Stewart was a small trading community where locals gathered around the train depot and the river docks. Ashley walked into the Bank of Stewart, drew a firearm, and demanded the cash on hand. The group took roughly $4,000 in currency, a substantial amount for the era, and made a rapid exit toward their vehicle. However, during the commotion inside the bank, one of Ashley's accomplices accidentally discharged a weapon. The bullet ricocheted and struck Ashley directly in his right eye. Bleeding heavily and needing urgent medical care, Ashley was unable to retreat into the Everglades as planned. Deputies tracked the vehicle along a muddy coastal road and took Ashley into custody within hours. He was transported under guard to a medical facility in Miami, where surgeons removed his injured eye. While in custody awaiting trial for both the Bank of Stewart robbery and the earlier incident involving DeSoto Tiger, Ashley was held in the Dade County Jail in Miami. On June 2, 1915, his brother, Bob Ashley, attempted a bold breakout at the jail facility. The attempt resulted in a fatal shootout outside the building that claimed the lives of both Bob Ashley and Miami Police Deputy Sheriff Wilbur Hendrickson. John Ashley remained in custody and was ultimately sentenced to 17.5 years at the state penitentiary. 7.3. Escapes and the Prohibition era. State prison life in the 1910s included labor details working on public road construction across rural Florida. In March 1918, while working on a road crew in Marion County, John Ashley slipped away from the guards and melted into the scrub pine wilderness. He returned immediately to his familiar hiding grounds in the Everglades, where he re-established contact with his longtime partner, Laura Upthegrove. By 1920, the passage of the 18th Amendment had transformed the Atlantic coastline of Florida. The thousands of miles of uninhabited inlets, coves, and shallow waterways became primary transit corridors for wooden vessels bringing rum and spirits from the Bahamas. Ashley and his associates shifted their focus. They established camps deep in the sawgrass near Canal Point and western Boynton Beach. Rather than running liquor themselves across the open ocean, the gang began intercepting other bootleggers along the canal banks, seizing their cargo and reselling it in West Palm Beach and Miami. When law enforcement attempted to search the swamps, the posse members frequently lost the trail. The gang used light wooden skiffs that could glide over shallow marsh water, where heavy law enforcement boats would quickly ground themselves on mudflats. 7.4. The final interception at St. Lucie Inlet. By 1924, Palm Beach County Sheriff Bob Baker had coordinated a multi-agency strategy to end the years of coastal robberies and train holdups linked to the group. Sheriff Baker recognized that chasing the group through the interior sawgrass was ineffective. Instead, deputies began monitoring the narrow choke points along the coastal roads where bridges crossed inlets and river mouths. On the night of November 1st, 1924, law enforcement received an anonymous tip that John Ashley and 3 remaining members of his group, Hanford Mobley, Ray Lynn, and Clarence Middleton, were traveling north along the Dixie Highway in a black Ford automobile. Their destination was believed to be a secluded camp near the St. Lucie River. Deputies erected a roadblock at the wooden bridge spanning the St. Lucie River near Roseland, Florida. They placed heavy chain cables across the bridge deck and pulled off into the roadside brush to wait in the dark. At approximately 10:30 p.m., the black Ford approached the bridge. When the driver saw the chain barrier, he brought the car to a sudden stop. Deputies stepped out from the shadows with weapons drawn, commanding the men to surrender. The 4 men exited the vehicle and were ordered to place their hands up, while deputies conducted a search for concealed weapons. What happened next remains a subject of historical debate among Florida archivists. According to official police reports from 1924, as deputies approached to apply handcuffs, one of the men made a sudden movement toward his waistband. Firearms were discharged by deputies in the dark. All 4 members of the gang, including John Ashley, were killed instantly on the wooden bridge deck. The deaths of Ashley and his associates effectively brought an end to one of the longest frontier-era outlaw sagas in South Florida history. Today, the locations where the group once hid are covered by state parks and residential communities, but historical markers along the St. Lucie River quietly mark the legal transition of early 20th century Florida. Case 8. The Vanishing at Lake Panasoffkee. Little Miss Panasoffkee, 1971-2012. 8.1. A Quiet Lake in Sumter County. To understand this story, picture the serene interior of Central Florida in February 1971. Away from the bustling coastal beaches, Sumter County was a region of quiet cypress swamps, moss-draped oak groves, and slow-moving waterways. Running north and south through this rural landscape is Interstate 95 and Interstate 75. where I-75 crosses over the marshy outlet of Lake Panasoffkee, a high concrete highway bridge spans the tranquil water below. On February 19, 1971, two teenage boys hitchhiking near the lake walked underneath the I-75 overpass and noticed a partially submerged bundle near the shoreline. When local Sumter County deputies arrived, they recovered the remains of a young woman who had been murdered and hidden beneath the bridge structure. She carried no identification, no purse, and no personal effects. For over 40 years, she was known simply to law enforcement and forensic investigators as Little Miss Panasoffkee. 8.2. The 4-decade forensic investigation. The initial investigation stalled almost immediately due to the absence of missing persons reports matching her description in Florida. However, forensic artists and medical examiners refused to let her case fade into obscurity. Over the decades, as forensic science advanced, researchers applied cutting-edge technologies to her case. 1971. Initial autopsy. Pathologists noted unique physical features, distinct European-style dental work, an orthopedic surgical pin in her right ankle, and evidence that her right leg was slightly shorter than her left, likely causing a mild limp. 2012 isotope ratio analysis. Dr. Wolfram Meyer Augenstein conducted stable isotope analysis on hair and bone samples. The chemical signatures in her tissues, derived from the water and food she consumed in childhood, revealed that she had spent her early life in Lorient, Greece, a Mediterranean coastal town known for historic lead mines. 2015. Forensic genealogy. Advanced DNA extraction allowed genetic genealogists to construct a partial family tree, linking her genetic markers directly to families residing in Greece and Australia. 8.3. Restoration of identity and peace. In 2015, 4 decades after her discovery, investigators officially confirmed her identity. Constantina Silvia Constantinidou. Silvia had moved from Greece to the United States in the late 1960s, settling in the Northeast before traveling south to Florida shortly before her death in early 1971. While the search for the person responsible for her death continues, the decades-long commitment of forensic scientists, county deputies, and genetic researchers achieved something profound. They gave Silvia her name back, ensuring that her story ended not as an anonymous statistic, but as a recognized human life remembered with dignity. Remembering their lives. As we reach the end of tonight's journey, it is important to pause and remember the people at the center of every investigation. Before they became part of a case file, they were living ordinary lives. They had families who loved them, friends who laughed with them, co-workers who expected to see them the next day, dreams they hoped to fulfill. The passage of time never changes the value of a human life. Although investigations may eventually conclude, the memories carried by those who loved them continue for years, often for a lifetime. Tonight, we honor those lives with quiet respect, not for the way their stories ended, but for the lives they lived. Coming home to Florida. As our journey comes to an end, we return once again to the Florida so many people know and love. The stories we have reflected upon tonight represent only a small part of Florida's history. They do not define the state. Instead, Florida is defined by the millions of ordinary people who care for their families, support their communities, and work each day to build a brighter future. That resilience is perhaps the state's greatest strength. As we leave Florida tonight, may we carry with us gratitude for those who dedicate their lives to seeking truth, appreciation for the ordinary moments we share with those we love, and hope that every community continues striving toward a safer tomorrow. Thank you for spending part of your evening with me. I hope tonight's story gave you a deeper appreciation for the people who sought the truth and compassion for the families whose lives were forever changed. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, I'd be honored to have you join me again. Next time, we'll journey to another state and discover another story. Every night has a story.